Welcome back to the final night of the 14th Annual Criminal Justice Academy. I am Salita Scott. I am Chief Counsel of the Marion County Prosecutor's Office. Thank you everyone for attending. For those of you who were unable to attend, thank you for tuning in on Channel 16 and YouTube. At the conclusion of tonight, you all who have attended all 3 sessions will receive your coveted CJA t-shirt, which I know is important to everybody. The Criminal Justice Academy allows public safety agencies and the community to come together to have important, real discussions about the issues that directly affect our community. We are proud to have these important conversations annually. Tonight, you will be getting an inside look into an investigation that utilizes enhancements in DNA technology to solve crimes. You will learn a little bit about DNA and do a deep dive into a case that was cold for 20 years before DNA changed everything. As a result of DNA, we were able to locate a suspect and gain a conviction. Tonight, our panelists are Elena Krieger, who has worked with the Indianapolis Forensic Services Agency for almost 13 years. Her work there began as an intern, and she was hired as the biology laboratory technician. Since then, she has become a serologist, a DNA analysis, and a CODIS administrator. She was raised an Army brat, which gives her her love of traveling. When she is not working, she loves to kayak, hike, and camp. And she is a huge, huge football fan. And if she was up here right now, she would say, "Go Colts!" Linda Major is a Marion County Deputy Prosecutor in our Special Victims Unit, where she litigates major felony, sex crimes, and child neglect cases. Ms. Majors began her career as a trial attorney in the Domestic Violence Unit nearly 28 years ago. Her many years of experience and exemplary trial record has made her one of the state's most leading experts in the fields of domestic violence and sex crimes. If you'd all join me in welcoming our panelists.
Thank you all very much, but I would like to actually give you all the hand for being here, for prioritizing understanding the criminal justice system. So many times we get involved. Is that better? Okay, sorry. I'm a mover and a talker, so we'll just do this way. So many times we get caught up in conversations where we're in our community and we have so many complaints about the criminal justice system, but you all are actually empowering yourselves with knowledge by coming here today and throughout the whole series that we've had to learn about the criminal justice system so that you can go home in your communities and really tell people what you've learned about the way things really operate. So thank you so much for coming. So we are today going to be discussing prosecuting cases with DNA, and as you know, we're going to be talking about a case study, State versus Donald Thomas, and so we'll be presenting some of the facts of that to you and just let you know from beginning to end how we got through that. So we're also joined by Elena Krieger, who is a forensic scientist. She was not the forensic scientist on that case, but she is absolutely one of our go-to people, very knowledgeable in this area, and so you guys are in for a real treat this evening. All right. I want to start off with a little bit of an advisory first of all. The State versus Donald Thomas case does involve a sex crimes case that did involve a rape. And although you won't be seeing descriptive photographs of the victim of that case, you will be seeing photographs of the scene itself. And so I wanted to make sure that if you feel that this is not something that you can be a part of, because those are the photos, I wanted to give you forewarning to let you know that some of those pictures could be disturbing. So everybody tends to think DNA, oh, you got DNA, that means case closed, case solved, open and shut. One of the things I really want to help underscore is that DNA is not the be-all, end-all with our cases. What does DNA tell us? Well, DNA tells us simply whether someone's DNA is present. So let's say, for example, you happen to be the victim of a robbery in your home. But earlier that day, you went out, you were Christmas shopping, and the cashier packaged up a gift for you, and you took the gift home. The gift was in your living room, and after the robbery happens, crime lab comes out, and they're trying to get the fingerprints and all of that. They're probably going to find the cashier's fingerprints on that gift that was left. Does that mean that the cashier was the person that robbed you? No. Not necessarily. Maybe she followed you home, but not necessarily. So DNA simply tells us that someone's DNA is present. What it doesn't tell us is the circumstances regarding how or why someone's DNA is present. So for example, even if you have a situation with a rape case, one person may say that they were raped, where the other person says consensual sex. So DNA can be helpful, but it's not always a dispositive tool. So, boy, was that the wrong choice for color. Notwithstanding, DNA can be an extremely helpful and persuasive piece of evidence. So for that example that I just gave, let's say you have a situation, one of the cases that I try as a sex crimes prosecutor is sex crimes cases as well. Well, if a 6-year-old has an interview with a police officer after disclosing to a teacher that she had been molested by her uncle, says that she had been molested, and the uncle says, no way, I've never touched the kid. But the uncle's DNA is in places inside of that child's body that it shouldn't be. That DNA in that case is probably pretty dispositive, right? May not tell the whole story, but it's 99.9% of the story in that situation, because it shouldn't be there. So it can be a very persuasive piece of evidence. So how do we actually get DNA? Very basic, it's collected and then processed and evaluated by the crime lab, and we'll have Elena talk a little bit later about the evaluation of that. Where can it come from? It can come from, for example, medical examination. One of the things that's very important, if you happen to know someone who is a survivor of a sexual assault, something that just happened, they disclose that information to you, always, always, always encourage that person to go to the hospital. Why is that so important? They may not be ready to talk to the police about it. They may not ever want to talk to the police about it. Some of the hindrances could be fear. Maybe the person is still in shock. Maybe they're embarrassed about it. But they may not want to let the police know. They may not want to notify them. And if they go to the hospital, unless there's a specific set of circumstances, like maybe there was a firearm or something involved, they are not going to report that to the police because it's a private thing. Now, if the person does go to the hospital, they can still get treatment. They can get treatment such as treatment for sexually transmitted diseases. They can get in front of HIV, potentially to prevent pregnancy. They can get a Plan B pill. We have in our hospitals now what is called the Center of Hope. It's a station, like an examination room, at each of the hospitals that specifically works with survivors of domestic violence, sexual assault, in collecting evidence and working with those individuals on how they can stay safe, providing the resources, safety planning, all of that, in addition to collecting that evidence on scene. So a medical examination, when they get that information, is one way that evidence can be collected. Now, it's not evaluated at that stage, but it is collected at that stage. Another way we get evidence is if it's gotten on scene. So for example, scene of a crime. There are certain things that are left on scene, whether it's a bullet, whether it's a pair of shorts, whatever the case may be, that evidence that can then be collected. It's collected very carefully with gloves, it's itemized, it's taken to the property room, and we'll see that in a little bit. And it is carefully then evaluated once it goes through the crime lab. So several years ago, I had a case, it's actually one of the first couple of years that I was trying sex crimes cases, State versus Donald Thomas. Now, this was a case that happened in 1998. I'm 53 years old, but even for me, 1998, that was a long time ago when I started trying this case. It was a situation where a woman was in her home, young woman was in her home, it was an apartment complex, and she heard a knock at the door. She opened the door, young man said that he needed to use the phone. She allowed him to use the phone. Person said, person's not there, can I come back and finish the call later? There was no answer. So, feeling a little bit, I guess, safer at that point, she said, sure, no problem, you can come on back. 5 minutes later, the man comes back to her apartment, knocks on the door. Oh, I know where you're here. She hands the phone. She begins doing things in her house. The next thing she knows, the man is in her apartment with a knife to her. At that point, she is raped repeatedly at knife point, also required to perform oral sex as well. And at some point there was a conversation that happens between them. She sort of talks him down from thinking about killing her, and then he ultimately decides to leave. So after that happens, she decides to call the police. The police come out, they photograph evidence, there's some evidence that's actually collected on scene, and then time goes on. They're not able to identify who the person is. She had never seen the person before, as far as she knew. So time goes on, 17 long years or 18 years go by. Then in the year 2016, we get what's called a CODIS hit. The defendant in this particular case, in the year 2004, ended up getting arrested for another crime. It was a driving offense that he got arrested for. As a result of that offense, in the county where he was in, they required him, because he was a felon, to have a buccal swab, which is a swabbing the inside to get a DNA sample, and that DNA went into a database. Then sometime later in 2015, the IMPD got a grant to start looking at some of these cold cases. And when they did that, they ran comparison of analysis of something that they got from the inside of the woman's shorts that had been collected for evidence, and were able to get what we call that DNA hit through CODIS. And that was in 2015. And Elena's going to tell you a little bit more about CODIS.
Good evening. So for those of you that don't know what CODIS is, it's the Combined DNA Index System. It's run by the FBI at the national level. They are the bosses as far as CODIS goes. There are 3 levels of it though. So IMCFSA, which is where I am, we are the local index. So we're the low man on the totem pole.
Say that again.
We are the local index.
But you use 3 letters, what we do.
Sorry?
You use 3 letters?
IMCFSA.
More than 3.
More than 3. I work for IMCFSA, which is the Indianapolis-Marion County Forensic Services Agency. We are on the low man of that hierarchy there. So we are an ELDIS lab, a local lab. ISP, which is the Indiana State Police Crime Lab, they would be the state level lab. And then INDIS is the national level. So if the sample can get to INDIS, it's going to be compared to profiles entered into the database from all of the other 50 states. Okay? So for us, we are entering in forensic profiles only. So it is samples coming directly off of crime scene samples. So this sample that Linda mentioned from the shorts was entered into CODIS at our level, and then it was searched across the state level, and then of course at the national level. I believe the hit came from the state level to that buccal standard that she talked about being submitted in 2004. That would be what we would call an offender hit. So all offenders, and now currently Indiana is an arrestee state, so if you are arrested for a felony, you are also required to give a buccal standard. Those are going to be processed at the state level and maintained at the state level. And then once I enter something into CODIS, I could potentially hit to those offender samples. ISP will do a confirmation of that hit, and then they will inform me of a name to actually submit to IMPD or whatever other Marion County agency I might be servicing. And then they will go out and they will collect a new buckle standard that we will use for confirmation. Okay? So there is a slight misconception about CODIS, I think, as far as not only IMPD, but also for the public. Every single DNA profile that we actually develop from evidence samples is not eligible for CODIS. There are very, very strict rules. This is a list of said rules. These are mandated by the FBI. The purpose of them is to make sure that we are not entering people into CODIS or evidence items into CODIS that are not related to the crime. We do not want consensual partners in there. We don't want victims in there. We don't want people not associated with the crime at all in there. So in order for us to enter a profile into CODIS, we have to ask ourselves a series of questions. And there has to be documentation to answer these questions in order for us to upload into CODIS. Now, as far as sex crimes goes, usually most everything is CODIS eligible, because in that case, the very first question, a crime has been committed, sexual assault, and then the profile obtained from the crime scene evidence. In most cases, the crime scene evidence is the victim's body. So that is usually why sex crime cases can end up in CODIS, which is how this underwear sample would have ended up in CODIS to therefore get the hit to ISP and the 2004 buckle.
Thank you. All right, so we've got a CODIS hit on a case that happened in 1998, sometime in 2015. His DNA is there, case closed, right? Easy case. I'm not really even having to earn my money on this case, right? No, wrong. We needed to have an investigation because, as we mentioned earlier, who knows at this point how the DNA, or why we have the DNA. We haven't done a full investigation as to how the crime has happened. So, initially we had to do victim notification or interview. So the detective who ended up being on this case, not the original one, but the one who got it after the CODIS hit, was phenomenal. She went out, the victim was actually living in another state. She got permission to go out and talk with the victim on this case and talk to her about the fact that we had what we thought was a CODIS hit. Explained all of that, what all of that meant. So now this person who was living her own life, had her own child, had a marriage, living her life, is now dealing with the fact that this rape that happened some almost 20 years ago is now back at literally at her front doorstep. Well, not literally, but is at her front doorstep, and now has to make a decision as to whether or not this is something that she still wants to pursue now that she's living her own wonderful life. So in addition to that, in the interview that came from that, the detective also went out and did an interview with the defendant. At least gave him the opportunity, and the defendant in that case actually did give a statement. And additionally, it just took some excellent, old-fashioned police work. If you can imagine trying to find something that you've even lost around your house, maybe you've been living there for maybe 5 or 6 years, it can be very difficult to try to find little pieces or things that you've been looking for on your own that you know where they should be. This is a case 20 years old nearly, going back to an apartment complex with a new apartment complex manager. Things had been repainted, redone, redesigned. All of this stuff is stuff that the detective had to navigate through. The detective took the statement, and when she took the statement of the defendant, one of the things that he had mentioned was, oh yeah, I met some woman, I don't remember her name was, at a pool. Well, one of the things that she had to figure out was there a pool in that apartment complex? And had there ever been a pool in that apartment complex? Because what we want to make sure is that we can provide every single piece of evidence possible so that members of our community can have everything that they have to be able to make a decision about somebody's guilt or lack thereof. So ultimately we ended up charging rape as a Class A felony because the testimony that Amy gave about the incident was that it was done at knife point, as I mentioned to you earlier, And also count 2 was criminal deviant conduct, which was a Class A felony, also at knife point. Now, back in 1998, because we had to use the old statute because of when the crime occurred, criminal deviant conduct was what was also referred to as oral sex. Now, the statute has changed a little bit, and it's considered rape as well, but it's criminal deviant conduct back then. So he was charged with 2 Class A felonies for separate acts that were committed. Actually, he could have been charged with more than just 2 counts, but that was the decision on that. So, this case, being nearly 20 years old, did have quite a few problems. And I took this from my actual notes that I put in the case in our computer system, just to give you a little bit of an idea of what I was dealing with. Rape kit is destroyed. Now, the rape kit is what they did, that's what they colloquially refer to now, it's called a sexual assault kit, at the hospital. She did go to the hospital, she did go to a center of hope, and she did have consult with the nurse. That kit that had everything with it, because it was so close to 20 years old, had actually, unfortunately, been destroyed. So all of the evidence that we had from the inside of Amy's body was gone. We had no original medical records for that either, because the hospital leading up to 20 years under that had a policy that anything, I guess, over 50, I don't know what it was, but anyway, we didn't have the medical records because those had also been purged out. The original detective file was lost or destroyed. So the original detective on the case, we no longer had that, and the original detective, because I was writing in the present sense, does not remember anything about the case. Again, 1998, I'm sure that he's had not a million, but very many cases since then. But that was disappointing to find out as well. Furthermore, what the original detective did do regarding an investigation was not thorough and quite frankly seemed as if he did not believe Amy. One of the important details with respect to the case was that there was cash on top of her dresser. She said that the cash was on top of her dresser because the defendant, after talking to her, after she tried to humanize herself after this rape so that she wouldn't be killed, was because she talked about how she was going through a difficult time with her job and trying to find a job. And instead of stealing her money after emptying her purse, he decided to put the cash back because he felt bad on top of her dresser. So we did have a photograph, if I recall correctly, of the money on top. However, the detective believed that that money got there actually some other way because of something consensual that had happened between the 2 of them. Not sure why he believed that, because the evidence didn't support that in any way, shape, or form, and we didn't even have a suspect at that time. And finally, the defendant's argument in this case was going to be consent. Now, this could have been potentially problematic. A lot of defendants think that this is prosecutor kryptonite, right? Because if my DNA is there, then the reason is because it was a consensual event. And that's what he was going to argue on this case. Fortunately for us, when the detective went out to interview him, the first thing she asked for was a buccal swab, which actually ended up, I believe, making him feel like they've got something on me. So I better come up with something as far as why I was in her apartment. So what's his argument? His argument is consent. This case, being nearly 20 years old, really underscored the importance of the integrity of the evidence. Every case that we try as prosecutors, one of the first and most important things that we need to make sure is that the evidence on our case make sure of the integrity of the evidence on our case. So what exactly does that mean? It means that things need to be collected with gloves, things need to be sealed, things need to be boxed up appropriately. On this particular case, here we go. Amy, that's the victim's name, her shorts, she had a bra on, she had a shirt on as well that had both been removed by the offender, and that is the towel that was used after the defendant ejaculated on her and wiped up the ejaculate as well. And that phone is important as well, and we'll talk about that in a minute. All of that evidence, except for the phone and the fan that you saw in that picture, was collected by Crime Lab. It was put in nice little bags that were then put in a box. And you can see everything that was in there. 2 sheets, a towel, pair of shorts, cut tank top and bra, and also the billfold for Amy. Elaine, if you could talk a little bit more about the importance of evidence packaging and storage.
Yeah, the paper packaging is key. Plastic, bad, paper, good. For evidence packaging and everything, it's about ventilation. You put something in plastic, it can't ventilate, you run the risk of mold. Also, really, really important, that everything is dry. So we do not have the space, and by we, I mean the lab, I mean IMPD's property room, whoever is going to maintain the evidence for any kind of long period of time, they do not have the space to put it frozen or refrigerated. Biological evidence doesn't need to be frozen or refrigerated as long as it has been thoroughly dried. Then you can reduce the risk of the mold and the degradation of the DNA in the long term. Also, the evidence sealed and tamper evidence. So we consider a proper seal to be evidence tape, and then you have your initials and a date of the packaging across the tape. So it's really, really important that we have that because we are questioned about the integrity of the evidence on the stand sometimes. Defense attorneys will absolutely attack the evidence, throw out my DNA results if there are any questions about the integrity of the item that I got the DNA profile from. So our chain of custody back then, I assume, it was probably handwritten. Now it is all electronic. It is so much harder for us to lose it. Back then it would have been a problem more than likely because everything would be on paper or written directly on a box for like a sexual assault kit. The chain of custody is basically, it's just a chronological order of every single person who has ever handled the item. Any person who's ever tested the item, and so you know exactly where it was from the time that it was collected until the time that it gets presented in court, and then I have to provide the DNA results for said item. Again, really, really important because they can attack the credibility of the scientists and of the collectors and of the police that collected the item, and they can also then attack the validity of the testing that was done, and that testimony that I would give regarding that would be completely thrown out if there was any question from the item to begin with about its integrity.
Which actually was an issue with respect to this case. So although the box itself, let me scroll back up here really quickly. Although the box itself had the proper seals, etc. on it, there were several things, those items on the inside, some of which had just been rolled up as opposed to stapled, and the way things have progressed now since 1998 is that things are a lot more, I guess, formal, right? So now those items would have been properly stapled. Each of those individual items also would have been labeled, etc. It was a lot more, I guess a lot less formal then, but the box itself was actually taped and everything was appropriate on that. So fortunately, we survived that during trial. That was not a problem since, as I said, the actual box the evidence was in was all properly sealed and marked with everyone's signature on it. So, while that time period went on, the evidence sat and it waited and it sat and it waited until we finally got the COVID hit. And so then, once we got the COVID hit, what did I say? COVID. I said COVID hit. I'm so sorry. So one of my friends that I have not been around recently just was diagnosed with COVID, so that's probably where that came from. Sorry. So we got the CODIS hit, and so now here we are 17 years later, and it's time for the science to kick in.
Okay, so biological evidence in terms of what I do. You can see the vast list that is up here. Body fluids typically are the samples that are going to have the best source of DNA. So you're looking at your blood, semen, and saliva. Those three are highlighted because those are the three that we can actually test for the identification of that body fluid in the lab. So that would be what serology is. We are examining items of evidence and we are looking for stains that are attributable to a body fluid, and we can actually test for that prior to even getting to the DNA analysis part. A little bit less likely you see sweat, urine, feces, tissue down at the bottom. We don't have serology tests for those, but those are definitely going to hold your DNA in them as well. And then skin cells, that's the big one right now. Skin cells all over everything, transfer all over everything. Usually, like Linda said earlier, I can tell you if the DNA is present. I cannot necessarily tell you how it got there. Biological evidence, these are just some examples of some of the places that you can get biological evidence. In this case,
It's probably not attached to that one.
Oh.
Just use the stem button.
okay, so in this case, there was the towel. She showed it in the big picture with the phone and the shorts. So the towel was still available for testing the 17 years later. So the towel came into the lab. This is just a picture of the towel before we got our hands on it. This is kind of an example of what the towel will look like after we get it. So you see it's marked up with Sharpie, it's got some holes in it. We did that in the course of our testing. So serology testing is looking for semen stains, in this case semen stains. We can do blood and saliva as well, but obviously semen is the probative body fluid in this case. We have to go through serology testing. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to look at it under an alternative light source. Pictures under the alternative light source are really sometimes difficult to take, so there aren't any good pictures of the original towel. So I added these in here. I made these samples and I took these pictures during my training as a serologist. So, oh my, go back.
Okay, sorry. I thought you were...
No. Yeah. Okay, so this is what semen looks like underneath an ALS. That's that segment of the carpet that says area 2. It's this really intense, light color underneath the alternative light source. Just for a little bit of a contrast, the circular ones on the right-hand side on the pillowcase, those are saliva stains. So substantially lighter. They don't really fluoresce the way semen does, but semen lights up like a Christmas tree underneath the ALS. And then you can also see on the pillowcase that I have over to the right, the really big, like half moon shape, you see the dark segment, and then you see the intense light coming up from around it, kind of like a halo. I actually masked the semen on the pillowcase with blood. So that is also a possibility, that you can mask semen with blood for the purposes of the ALS. Yep. Also, after we do that visual examination, we're going to have a confirmatory test for semen. The one and only thing that is absolutely specific to semen is a sperm cell. So we are literally going to make a slide. We are going to look at it underneath the microscope, and we are going to look for sperm cells. That is what a sperm cell looks like. You can see with my little arrow, it's got that pink circular head on it, and then it has the green tail. So it's pretty easy to see. Most of the time the tails are gone by the time we get to it, because the tails are going to essentially die first. But usually they will last pretty indefinitely, providing that the sample is dried, hence why we were able to identify sperm and get a DNA profile from the towel 17 years later, because it had been dried and packaged appropriately, and then the kits that we have are so sensitive, so we can absolutely detect it that many years later. But also for contrast for this, just so you can see kind of what I see underneath the microscope, the top left-hand picture with the big green circle with the red in the middle, that's what a skin cell looks like. In this case, it's more than likely it's a vaginal skin cell, because that's really the only reason why we would look at these. But it's a green cell, and then the nucleus of the cell is what's dying red on there. And then on the right-hand side, you'll see those circular just straight circles, no green. That would be yeast cells. So for like a yeast infection, that's what that would look like under a microscope. Following the serology, we're going to do the DNA analysis. So the very first thing that we have to do is actually extract the DNA from the cells, from the sample. In the case of extraction, we do have a differential extraction that will allow us to separate a sperm cell from an epithelial cell. It absolutely takes advantage of the fact that a sperm cell is meant to survive. It is meant to survive in the vaginal cavity to get to the egg. That is what it's supposed to do. The cell wall of it is strong. It is going to be much more robust than a skin cell. So we can take advantage of that. And we can actually do a differential extraction where we are going to have one sample that ends up into two. We're going to have a sperm fraction, so whatever sperm is potentially there is going to end up in the sperm fraction sample. And then we're going to have the epithelial fraction that if there's skin cells there, will end up in the skin cells, or in the epithelial fraction. It really helps us to do the DNA interpretation. So the less mixture it is, the easier it is for us to interpret. And we potentially won't run into the inconclusive DNA samples. After extraction, we have to determine about how much DNA we have there. If there's enough, we do have thresholds. We can only do so much. So if there's no DNA there, we can't make something out of nothing. If there's enough there, we will target very specific locations on the DNA and we will amplify it. That is just making copies. Presumably, maybe people have actually heard the word polymerase chain reaction. That is the process of the amplification, and it's like a Xerox machine is how it's usually been compared in the past. We make a bunch of copies of the DNA at the locations that we're targeting, and then we can run it through an instrument that's going to separate it based on those sizes, and we get this piece of paper that comes out and poof, it's your DNA profile, or the DNA profile of the item. Over the years, in 1998, we didn't have a lot of the technology that we have now. And then it's progressed a ton in the last 20 years. What we have now, we look at 21 targets on the DNA, and then we have 3 additional targets that are gender determining. So you see a female is an XX, right? And then a male is an XY. So I actually have that as one of my targets. The DNA profile will come up and I will have an X for a girl, and I will have an XY for a boy. Very discriminating. The 21 locations, if you look at one singular location, or even 4 or 5 singular locations, you might share the same alleles as I have. But at 21 locations, you will not. Outside of an identical twin, your DNA profile is yours, and it is very discriminating. So when we do a kind of a match or a comparison, you're looking at statistics that are huge and these numbers that you can't even wrap your head around because there's so many zeros in them. Not most important part of what I do, I guess, but pretty important, my unknown profiles mean absolutely nothing if I don't have known profiles to compare them to. So if I have these knowns, I said earlier, not everything that we get goes into CODIS. Not everything we have is going to be eligible to go into CODIS. So if we don't have standards to do the comparison, then we are not going to be able to do anything with the profile. It just sits there. So the unknowns is from the evidence. The knowns would be your standard. So typically, Linda mentioned a buccal cell standard. It's just the inside of your cheek swab. That's predominantly what we use now. Not very often do we actually get a blood sample from anybody. Also, as Linda said, we are not the full story. There are very often times that we don't get DNA on a sample. And that doesn't mean that something didn't happen. It doesn't mean that something did happen. But when we don't get DNA in a sexual assault, typically there are some things that, and I often have to testify to why I didn't get any results. For kit samples, a lot of times it can be due to time delay. If you don't go to the hospital and get a kit collected and 4, 5, 6, 7 days go by, the likelihood of me getting a DNA profile at that point is pretty low. Your life activities are taken into account to make that happen. So urinating, menstruating, mobility, gravity, all of these things are going to affect the drainage from the vaginal cavity and why I might not get DNA on a kit sample. If it's dried on a towel, like in this case, like I said, it can last forever. But body fluids, of course, too. As I said, the body fluids are going to have much more DNA in them, many more cells for me to potentially get DNA. So if ejaculation occurred, I am more than likely going to get a DNA profile than if it's something like a digital penetration case or just penile penetration with no ejaculation. The mixture ratio is also very important. When you think about it from a kit standpoint, you're going to have a sample that's collected from the body of an individual. You expect their DNA to be there, a ton of it, because it came off of their body. So their DNA could potentially mask the DNA of a potential perpetrator just because there's so much DNA there. That's that benefit of that differential extraction as well. If I can get past some of that mixture ratio, it might be a little bit easier for me to detect foreign DNA to the individual that the sample was collected from.
One of the things that I want to make sure that we all understand is, as I mentioned earlier, DNA really is only half of the story. Sometimes, as I mentioned earlier, it can be very persuasive, but other times it just tells us that somebody was there. So in this case, where the defendant was arguing consent, it really didn't move the needle very much, other than forcing him, once he realized we probably did have his DNA, to acknowledge that he was at least on scene. Which for a prosecutor, that's a really big deal. I mean, now all I have to do is show at that point that the sex was not consensual and in fact it was a rape. All right. So in this particular case, much of the testimony, much of the evidence was the testimony. One of the things I really try to educate jurors on while we do voir dire is the understanding that testimony is evidence. Evidence is anything that evidence is something that can be used to show the nature of what it is that's been alleged in this particular case. So in the state of Indiana, testimony, the testimony of a single eyewitness is enough to convict beyond a reasonable doubt if the jurors believe that person's testimony beyond a reasonable doubt. So, in addition to the other evidence that we had, the evidence of Amy's testimony and the testimony of others was really critical in this case. Something else that was very persuasive in this case was her demeanor. When I questioned her, I think that my direct examination of her might have been somewhere around an hour and a half or 2 hours long. Why would my direct examination of her have been so long? The reason is, when it comes to prosecution of really any case, but particularly sex crimes cases, the conviction is in the details. So I had to take her through every moment, not just what was happening, but what she was thinking as well as these things were happening to her. Her account was very critical. There were some things that she remembered slightly differently over the last 20 years, but I think the jury did not have a problem with that because it had been 20 years. Whether or not a cup was red or blue was really not a big deal. But when she could describe the essence of the sexual assault basically the same way that she was able to describe it later, that was pretty persuasive. It's also important to know that when people, I could do a whole presentation on the neurobiology of trauma, but when people remember things, how things are coded in the mind isn't necessarily the way that it comes out when they're talking about it, chronologically speaking. But her account was very persuasive. It was pretty much the same as it had been when she had first talked about it 20 years ago. Also, we had the defendant's statement, as I said, which also spoke of consent. There were some other things that he said during his testimony that the quality investigation that the detective did was able to show that he was just lying. For example, there had been no pool in the apartment complex where she lived, where he said that they initially met. Other little details like that the detective was able to show those things never happened or those things never existed, showed the defendant to be a liar. Additionally, after she gave her story about what happened, photographs were also taken on scene, which were very important. The phone that she said had been used in the kitchen area to that she allowed him to call, actually turned out to be a fake call, it wasn't really a call, but he was giving her the impression that he was making a telephone call. The phone cord was missing from that phone, which also gave corroboration to what she was saying. The edges of the clothing items, the defendant had described a consensual sexual relationship where either he removed her clothes or she removed her clothes. But what she had described was that he had taken the knife and cut the side of her clothing and cut the side of her bra as well. And sure enough, the photographs, as we'll see in a little bit, certainly demonstrated that. She also indicated that she sprained her foot. After the defendant left the scene, she was afraid to go out of the same door that he went out of because he thought he would kill her. So she jumped off of the balcony, second floor, to the first floor, and she sprained her foot. Also, the money on the dresser, another detail that she had mentioned as to why that money actually was there, the fact that he had dumped her purse all out on the floor. And also, her boyfriend at the time actually called during this assault. She was not able to answer the phone, obviously, because she was being assaulted. And so we reached out 20 years later to that ex-boyfriend and talked to the ex-boyfriend about what the relationship had gone through. Did he remember what led up to it? And also, he was the first person that she called, maybe the second, she might have called her mom first, but the first or second person that she called. We call that a disclosure witness. The reason that a disclosure witness is so important is because that is the first person that the victim, survivor of a crime, talked to when she's scared, when she's frustrated. That is the first person that is talked with after the assault, and so that person generally has really good information about the demeanor of the victim and things that happened and things that were said. And also, he would have testified that the relationship changed after this assault, and their relationship did not survive that. So fortunately, even though the original detective's investigation was not very good, the person that took the photographs, the evidence technician, we did have great evidence, we did have great photos. One of the things that Amy said was that after she gave the phone to the defendant the second time he came back, that she was putting dishes away at the time. So we can see from this picture, what do you notice about the picture? The cabinet doors are open, as they might be if you were putting away dishes. Additionally, I don't know if you can see it fully from this picture, but the dishwasher also was open. We had a picture of the dishwasher that had been open at the time. Again, little details that corroborate her version of the events. She said when he came into the house, he forced her down on the floor right there and then tied her hands and her feet together behind her back, or tied her hands behind her back, and he used the phone cord. You can't tell from this picture because some of the pictures actually were entered into evidence, and this was not one of them, but the phone cord is missing from the phone that was in the kitchen. Again, little details. She said that as she was tied up, before she was blindfolded, he also emptied out her purse. And there was a picture taken of the purse. Now, the only time as a woman I've ever emptied out my purse like that, and I don't think that I have, but anything that would be close to that is if I was changing purses. Women don't just walk into their house and empty their purse on the floor like that. So again, another piece of important corroborating evidence, which also went toward why she was so afraid. Her testimony was, after this incident, she only went back to that apartment one time with somebody that could help her move her things out, which is consistent with somebody that now knows obviously where she lives, but a lot of personal identifying information about her. She had no interest in going back to that place, number one, because he might return, and number two, because obviously the memories of what happened there. Here's a picture of the bra that she was wearing at the time that was not removed by either him or her, according to him, in a consensual relationship, but rather was cut up the sides and also the straps as well by the knife that he had held her at knife point. There's the second-story balcony that she jumped off of. And there, ladies and gentlemen, is the spot where she landed. And you can see how the ground there is disturbed. We've got wood over here, we've got some rocks generally in the middle, and there's even a piece of the, I guess the bushes are called yews over here, but there's a space down there that seems to be more bare or more bald. Now, could the defense argue that that was caused some other way? Yes, but does this narrative fit what she said in 1998 when she was still traumatized from the event that had happened? Absolutely, and that's what I argued. So the witnesses in this case, obviously the DNA, very important, but we also had Amy, who after her first day of testimony, I think it was like an hour and a half, like I said, maybe 2 hours on the stand, and also the defense attorney had done some, she had to come back the second day and testify some more for the defense attorney, and Amy looked like she had been through a war. It had been a very exhausting thing for her to do, and the jury saw that. The ex-boyfriend also testified about how it impacted their relationship, how he obviously was there for her, but that it was just not something, it wasn't something that their relationship could survive. The detective also testified, that is the second detective, and also the defendant testified, who did not do himself any favors when he testified. So, after only a couple of hours of deliberation, I'm happy to say, the defendant on this case was found guilty. He was found guilty of both counts. So both the rape and the not other sexual conduct. He was found guilty of both the rape and the criminal deviant conduct. The statute has changed, and the criminal deviant conduct. He was found guilty of both of those charges. Both of those charges carry a maximum at that time of 40 years, potentially at the Department of Correction. The judge could have decided to run those concurrently or consecutively. That means together or one after another. He was sentenced on this case to 35 years on each count consecutively. 70 years at the Department of Correction. And because of the level of the offense, he actually was having to do, the fact that he had a knife with him, he had to do 80% of that time. So, that's not the end of the story. The end of the story is, his original offer was not quite the 70 years. As I had said, there were a whole lot of issues that we had with this case. So the offer that was made on the case was actually to a Class B felony, which carries a maximum of 20 years. We made an offer of 15 years open sentencing, which meant that I could have asked for up to 15 years at the Department of Correction, which only would have gotten him 50% of the time that he had to do because of the way the statute was there. So he turned that down, and instead of 7.5 years in prison, he's actually serving, as I said, 70 years. He will never get out of prison. He'll die there. So, we have had several advancements even since then. I think, though, that we're kind of running out of time. Is that right? Okay, we've got 5 minutes. Elena, can you kind of talk about some of the advancements that we've had since then?
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, so YSTR testing is one of the tools that we have. In sexual assault cases, I had said earlier that mixture ratio can become a problem when you have so much female DNA because it came from her body and you are masking the male. So in those kinds of cases, we can resort to YSTR testing. Girls do not have a Y chromosome. So when we're at that amplification step where we are making copies of specific targets, girls do not have a Y chromosome to target. So we can amplify the sample by essentially eliminating her, and we are targeting only male DNA. So that can kind of overcome that mixture ratio problem. There is a little bit of a problem with the YSTR analysis though. It is absolutely not as discriminating as the kits that we actually use on a regular basis. It is not going to identify an individual, it is going to identify a paternal line. Every single male is going to inherit the Y from his father, and his father before him. And his uncle and his brother, all on his father's side, are all going to have the exact same Y profile. Okay? So yes, it can be helpful, but there are of course always some limitations to the things that we do. That will take too much time.
Yep.
Okay, so forensic genetic genealogy is not my wheelhouse. We do not do it, but you are going to hear a lot about it in the news. You are going to hear, it is one of the next big up and coming things that, what is that? That Golden State Killer out of California? Okay, that's this. This is something that labs are starting to get into, and basically what they're doing is they're taking DNA profiles that are not hitting in CODIS, whether it be they've never done another bad thing, they never ended up in CODIS, it could be they were, whatever this case was so cold, it was before CODIS even existed, and like I said, they've never been convicted of a felony since then, never been arrested for a felony since then. So we can't hit to anything if they aren't in there. So those kinds of cases are what are resorting to this. So they'll take that profile and they will use it to build family trees. And they are using it against these GEDmatch Pro family tree DNA. These are kind of databases of people that I think are doing like the 23andMe type stuff. And that's how they're building these databases. I can't, unfortunately, answer crazy specific questions about them because, like I said, we don't do it and it's not especially my wheelhouse. But you are going to hear about it. There are some differences. So if you look on the left, forensic DNA profiling, this is what I do. We use short tandem repeats. We're using segments of DNA. So those 21 locations are segments of DNA, strings, small strings of it. In this case, they can look at single base pair changes in DNA. They can look at so many more locations on the DNA than what I am doing. And then, like I said, they build these family trees and they find somebody who is related, could be distantly related. And then they will backtrack and do all of this crazy magic with genealogy that I, like I said, I'm curious about, but we aren't doing it yet. But that's just one of the next advancements that's going to happen, and you'll start hearing about it a lot in the news as these really old cases are starting to get solved.
And with that, we hope that you have learned a little bit more about DNA and prosecution. Again, DNA not the whole story. So if you are fortunate enough to be selected for a jury, just remember DNA is part of the story, but the whole story is looking at the testimony in conjunction with the DNA, in conjunction with the evidence before coming to a decision about somebody's guilt or lack thereof. Any questions?
Here's Mike.
Yes. Thank you. Forgot about. Yes.
It's not a question,
Okay.
but I would like to share with everyone, I had the unfortunate responsibility to testify against a sex offender who had molested a little friend of mine for years, and she prosecuted, and it was amazing. He got 75 years. Sorry, I didn't mean to embarrass you, but I had to say it.
Well, we like it when you say nice things like that. Can we give it up for both the crime lab and the prosecutor's office? I hope everyone learned a little bit from that presentation. Obviously, I'm very familiar with that case, and every single time I'm just struck by how it was a great combination of IMPD, the detective, the crime lab, and the prosecutor's office, everybody working together to get a result to ultimately bring justice for that victim. And I'd like to piggyback on the prior comment, just so everybody is aware and we are clear. Linda Major is the GOAT, the greatest of all time, does a wonderful job, and is one of the best prosecutors, not only in the state of Indiana, but in the entire country. And her level of commitment, her patience, how trustworthy she is, really just serves the victims incredibly well here in Marion County. But Linda would be the first person to tell you we couldn't do half the things we're able to do without our friends at the crime lab and all the incredible work that they do. And so I think this case highlights that remarkable partnership. And so thank you to everyone for coming out here today. We really do appreciate it. This is our 14th annual Community Justice Academy. I know many of you have been with us throughout those 14 years. We feel incredibly grateful that we have this opportunity to have this meaningful interaction with people in the community. And just so you guys know, the feedback and the information that you give us is what leads to the presentations for next year's topic. And so what suggestions you make, we will greatly appreciate. We will incorporate that into what we do. Just to give you a for instance, the topic that I covered as it related to jury selection, that topic was raised, and then we also heard a lot of questions about DNA, which is why we did the presentation here with Linda. And so whatever feedback that you guys provide, that will very much influence and impact the presentations that we do next year. And we're grateful that we've been able to do this for 14 years. And this started 14 years ago with an idea. And the person who was actually the architect of the Community Justice Academy, the person who definitely puts the community into the Marion County Prosecutor's Office is my good friend Annie Kern, and she is here today. And so Annie, since you started this, let's start off with our first t-shirt to Annie Kern. It's always great to have the alumni of the prosecutor's office and the great Annie Kern here. Everybody give it up one last time for Annie Kern. Thank you, Annie. And before we get into the presentation, another person I just wanted to recognize is, we're very fortunate at the prosecutor's office to get to partner up with a bunch of people in the community who do incredible work and are truly trying to make a difference in the lives of individuals. And we feel so incredibly fortunate to have these different partnerships. One of the strongest partnerships that we have, and somebody that I just learn from each and every single day, is my friend Anthony Beverly at Stop the Violence. So Anthony, if you come up here, so we can give you a t-shirt as well. And for those of you who don't know, we face a lot of challenges in Marion County, but one of the ways we're able to help turn kids around, have a positive impact, is the work that people like Anthony do every single day in our community. So give it up for Anthony. He'll look good in that t-shirt too.